Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. Comanche versus Apache, riders of the Southern Plains. The Southern Plains, a land of endless horizons where the grass whispers under the wind and the sky stretches so wide it seems to swallow the world. In summer, heat shimmers above the prairie until the earth itself looks ready to catch fire. In winter, blizzards sweep across the plains with the force of a hammer, reducing man and beast to shadows in a white storm. This is a land that tests you, and those who survive here do so by strength, cunning and will. It is in this unforgiving world that two peoples, both fierce and proud, collided again and again. The Comanche, the Apache, names that still carry weight like a drawn bowstring. Both masters of survival, warriors without equal in their own ways. Both claiming the same hunting grounds, the same waterholes, the same right to roam the plains. And in that overlap lay the seeds of a conflict that would span generations. The Apache were here first. Long before horses thundered across the plains, Apache bands roamed these lands on foot. They were an ancient people, part of a great migration centuries earlier, pushing down from the north into what we now call the American Southwest. They built lives in the deserts, the mountains, and the fringes of the grasslands. Skilled hunters, raiders, and traders, they moved through the landscape with the easy knowledge of those born to it. Their weapons were the tools of a pre-horse warrior culture, the short bow, designed for quick, lethal shooting in close country. Lances tipped with sharpened iron scavenged from trade or battle, shields made from thick buffalo hide, able to turn arrows and later even deflect a pistol ball at distance. In battle they moved in swift, loose formations, never giving an enemy the easy target of a tight rank. And they had something just as valuable as arms, deep alliances with Pueblo peoples to the west, and trading networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. But the world was about to change, violently. From the north came a people who would transform the balance of power, the Comanche. They were once part of the Shoshone, dwelling far to the north in what is now Wyoming. But sometime in the late 17th century, they acquired something that would redefine not only themselves, but the entire history of the plains, the horse. To understand the Comanche, you must first understand the horse. And to understand the horse, you must watch a Comanche boy grow up. From the moment he could walk, he was around them, tugging at his mother's skirt as she brushed a mare's coat until it shone like riverstone, listening to the deep, steady breath of the gelding tethered outside the lodge, feeling the heat of its flank against his cheek. His toys were not carved figures of warriors, but miniature horses made from scrap hide and sticks. Before he could ride alone, he was hoisted onto the back of a gentle pony, clinging to its mane while an older brother led them in slow, patient circles. By the age of 4 or 5, he was riding alone, bareback without reins, using only the press of his knees and the shift of his weight to guide his mount. There were no saddles to keep him in place, no stirrups to steady him. Every muscle in his young body learned balance the hard way, by swaying with the gait, by gripping tight when the horse broke into a sudden trot, by scrambling back up when he inevitably fell. It was not enough simply to stay on. He learned to read the horse's moods, the flick of an ear toward danger, the twitch in its shoulders before it shied, the rolling of its eyes when something unseen moved in the grass. These small signals became instinct to him, as natural as noticing the wind on his face. By his teenage years, the boy was no longer a passenger. He was part of the animal. They moved together as one creature, accelerating, turning, stopping in a heartbeat. He could lean low against the horse's neck, disappearing from an enemy's sight, or swing himself entirely to one side, firing arrows under the animal's throat without breaking stride. He could vault from one horse to another at a gallop, change mounts in mid-pursuit, and ride at full speed while dragging a second horse loaded with buffalo meat. Training was constant and deliberate. Every day he practiced quick mounts and dismounts, sometimes without slowing the horse at all. He rode into deep water to teach the animal to swim without fear. He ran it across broken country, teaching it to pick its footing over rocks and gullies. He raced it against others, feeling how much to push, how much to hold back for the moment when speed would matter most. The bow and arrows were never far from hand. Shooting from horseback was an art in itself, loosing 3 arrows before the first struck its target, each one aimed in the heartbeat between the rise and fall of the gallop. He learned to grip the reins in his teeth if necessary, freeing both hands for bow or lance. In time, he could strike a running buffalo in the lungs with one shot, or drop an enemy warrior from his saddle without ever slowing down. For the Comanche, this was not sport, it was life. Mastery came not from hours or days of practice, but from years lived in the saddle, the horse becoming as much a part of him as his own limbs. By the time he was a grown man, his skill was not something he thought about. It was simply what he was, a warrior who could ride like the wind, fight like the thunder, and vanish across the plains before his enemies even knew he was there. Horses had filtered north from the Spanish settlements in New Mexico and Texas, traded or stolen until they reached the Shoshone. For the Comanche ancestors, this was no mere tool, it was revelation. In the horse they saw freedom, speed, and power beyond anything they had known. They split from the Shoshone, striking south into the plains, where wild Mustang herds roamed by the tens of thousands. Here they became something new. Within a generation, the Comanche were the finest horsemen on the continent. Horses became wealth, status, and lifeblood. A Comanche man might own dozens, even hundreds, each suited for a different task. The fast, tireless buffalo runners, the sure-footed war mounts, the sturdy animals for carrying loads on the move. With this mastery came expansion. The Comanche swept south and east, pushing into the very heart of Apache territory. It was not an idle drift, and it was conquest. They sought the richest buffalo ranges, the best water, and the prestige of driving out rivals. And once they had tasted victory, they did not stop. The first clashes were brutal, small-scale affairs. Apache hunting bands caught unawares on the open plains, overwhelmed by warriors who seemed to appear from nowhere, loosing volleys of arrows at impossible speed before melting away. Horses turned the Comanche into a moving storm, able to strike across distances the Apache could never hope to match on foot. The Apache adapted quickly. They too learned the value of the horse, capturing and trading for them wherever they could. By the early 18th century, Apache warriors were mounted, but they were never as numerous in horseflesh as the Comanche, and on the open plains, numbers mattered. For the Apache, the horse was a later arrival, not born into their culture in the way it was for the Comanche, but adopted with fierce determination. They had once been hunters and fighters on foot, swift and tireless across mountain passes and desert trails. When the horse came, it was not a novelty. It was a revelation and a challenge. Apache boys began their riding life older than their Comanche counterparts, but they made up for lost time with sheer grit. An elder might choose a small, tough pony from the herd and tell the boy simply, "Ride it until it knows you." There were no lessons in the modern sense, no gentle introduction. Falls were expected, bruises inevitable. But each tumble taught balance. Each mistake sharpened instinct. The Apache way was shaped by their land. Where the Comanche raced across the open plains, the Apache rode in broken country, canyons, ridgelines, and thick timber where speed was less important than agility. A boy learned to coax his mount along narrow trails that crumbled into sheer drops, to duck low as branches whipped past, to leap small arroyos at a gallop without breaking stride. The horse was trained to halt in an instant, to turn sharply on loose rock, to stand silent and still for hours, if its rider willed it. Weapons practice began almost as soon as the boy could keep his seat. The bow remained a trusted tool, but the Apache quickly embraced firearms, especially muskets, and later, rifles. A young rider learned to brace the butt of the weapon against his thigh or hip, leaning forward to absorb the recoil, firing from the saddle and reloading while keeping his horse in motion. For them, the mount was not just a means to close the distance, it was a fighting platform, as useful in a running skirmish as in a swift retreat. What set Apache horsemanship apart was its discipline in stealth. A good Apache warrior could approach an enemy camp at night with his horse making no more noise than the wind. Hooves were wrapped in rawhide to muffle their sound. The animal was trained to respond to the lightest pressure, even a tap of a toe or a shift of the rider's weight. In this way, a small war party could strike and be gone before their enemies knew which way they had come. Their bond with their mounts was built on trust. An Apache warrior knew his horse's strengths, which one could carry him fastest over long desert miles, which was surest on a mountain trail, which could be counted on in the chaos of battle. He might keep only a handful of animals, but each was honed for a purpose, cared for with the same attention given to his weapons. By the time he was grown, an Apache horseman was not the whirlwind of the open plain like his Comanche rival. He was the shadow in the canyon, the rider who could vanish into the folds of the land, whose horse could stand as silent as a stone until the moment to strike, and then explode into motion with deadly precision. Apache war gear began to shift. They carried longer lances for mounted fighting, and their bows grew in draw strength, better suited for shooting from horseback. Muskets, traded from the Spanish or stolen in raids, began to appear. Slow to reload, unreliable in the wet, but devastating if fired in that first thunderous volley. Powder horns rattled at the hip. Lead shot was rolled in pouches of soft buckskin, but every musket ball fired meant one less in the pouch, and resupply was never guaranteed. By the mid-1700s, the southern plains were a chessboard of war. Apache bands fought not only the Comanche, but also Spanish colonists pushing up from the south and east. The Spanish had long dealt with Apache raids, swift strikes against missions and ranches, disappearing into the hills before soldiers could respond. But now they saw something worse. The Comanche were breaking the Apache hold on the plains, driving them towards Spanish territory. This was no accident. Comanche war leaders, men like Perua Semena, and later Iron Jacket, understood that the Apache could be worn down by constant raids, strike their horse herds, burn their camps, leave them no safe wintering grounds. The Apache, once the predators, found themselves hunted. A Spanish settler's diary from the 1740s describes a Comanche raid in chilling terms. They came at dawn, riding as if the wind carried them. We heard the thunder of hooves before we saw their faces. They circled the corrals, drove off every horse, and left 3 men dead in the dust. Their arrows fell like rain. Then they were gone, and the plain was empty again. For the Apache, displacement was more than just losing ground. It was losing identity. Plains life depended on the buffalo, and the buffalo herds followed ancient migratory paths. Without control of those ranges, Apache bands faced hunger and humiliation. They fell back toward the mountains and deserts, harsher country where the Comanche's horses were less of an advantage, but where game was scarcer. It was in these years that some Apache groups, like the Mescalero, developed a grim resilience. They became masters of ambush, using the terrain to even the odds. A Comanche war party on open plains was nearly untouchable, but drive them into the broken canyons, the forested slopes, and the Apache could turn the tables. In narrow defiles, a single musket shot could bring down a horse and block the path. Arrows launched from above would plunge into the mass of warriors below, yet the Comanche were learning too. They avoided such traps when they could, and when forced to fight in them, they used speed and shock to break free. Their war lances were deadly in close quarters, 8 or 9 feet of hardwood, tipped with steel and driven with the momentum of a galloping horse. A blow could pierce through shield and ribcage in one thrust. The rivalry hardened into blood feud. This was not a war of occasional raids, but a generational struggle. Boys grew into warriors, knowing they would fight the same enemy their fathers had fought. Victories were measured not in land held, but in enemies slain, horses taken, and the stories told around the campfire. A Comanche warrior might boast of riding 2 days without rest to strike an Apache camp, of counting coup by touching an enemy before killing him, of returning with the best of their horse herd. An Apache might tell of waiting motionless for hours above a canyon trail, of loosing the arrow that brought down a Comanche chief's mount, of disappearing into the desert with a prize stallion. Each side saw itself as the rightful master of the southern plains. Each saw the other as the intruder. And between them lay a killing ground that stretched from the Llano Estacado to the Pecos River. By the late 18th century, Spanish authorities began to see a strange and bitter irony. For decades they had struggled against Apache raids. Now they watched as the Comanche all but destroyed Apache dominance on the plains. At first, this seemed a blessing. Weakened Apache groups approached Spanish outposts seeking peace, or at least trade, in order to survive. But the price of that peace was high. The Comanche now stood at the gates. The stage was set for a new era of conflict, one in which the Spanish, and later the Mexicans and Americans, would try to play one side against the other. But for the Comanche and Apache themselves, the feud was far from done. In the next chapter of their war, the raids would grow larger, the stakes higher, and the southern plains would run red. By the early 19th century, the rivalry between Comanche and Apache had reached a fever pitch. No band, no rancheria, no herd was truly safe. The balance of power tilted constantly, shaped by the seasons, by the movements of the buffalo, and by the shifting alliances with outsiders, Spanish, Mexican, and soon enough, American. The Comanche held the advantage in sheer speed and striking power. Their war parties could cover 50 miles in a day, riding hard into enemy country, striking and then vanishing into the horizon before a counterattack could form. But the Apache had adapted in ways that made them just as dangerous in their chosen ground. They had traded range for resilience, and in the broken country of the Guadalupe Mountains or the dark canyons of the Gila, they could be as elusive and lethal as any predator. One late summer raid in 1812 became the stuff of campfire legend on both sides. A band of Comanche warriors, some 60 strong, pushed deep into Mescalero territory, driving a captured horse herd before them. They believed the Mescalero scattered, but they had misjudged. The Apache war leader, Chiquito, had been watching their movements for days, reading the signs in hoofprints and campfire ash. At dawn, as the Comanche picked their way through a narrow canyon, Mescalero muskets roared from the cliffs above. A war lance fell from a startled rider's grasp, clattering against stone. Horses screamed as lead balls struck, some tumbling into the dust with broken legs. The canyon became chaos, riders turning in tight circles, arrows hissing upward toward unseen shapes on the rim. The Comanche tried to break through in a furious charge, their ponies scrambling over rocks, but the Mescalero blocked the mouth of the canyon. It was only by sheer nerve and horsemanship that the Comanche war leader fought his way out, driving what was left of his herd before him. He left behind a dozen dead and a bitter vow. This insult would be repaid 100-fold. Revenge raids were not merely acts of bloodlust. They were essential to maintaining honor and prestige. Among the Comanche, a man's reputation could be made or broken by his deeds in battle. To lose warriors, to have horses taken, was an affront that demanded an answer. That winter, the same Comanche band returned. This time they came under cover of a snowstorm, riding in silence until the Apache campfires flickered through the falling white. They struck just before dawn. Warriors cut loose the picket ropes of the Apache horses, driving them into the dark. Others set fire to the grass shelters, the flames whipped into a frenzy by the wind. In the confusion, the Mescalero scattered into the night, but the cost was terrible. Almost all of their remaining horses were taken. Without them, winter hunting would be crippled. For the Comanche, this was a victory not only of arms, but of survival strategy. To strip an enemy of horses was to wound him deeper than any arrow. It robbed him of mobility, of status, of the means to raid in return. The Spanish governors of New Mexico, watching this cycle of raid and counter-raid, began to see opportunity. For years they had sought to reduce the Apache threat to their northern frontier. Now the Comanche were doing it for them. Spanish emissaries, friars, soldiers, traders, ventured into Comanche territory bearing gifts of trade goods, tobacco, and, most importantly, firearms. The Comanche were not naive. They accepted the guns, the powder, and the iron tools, but they were no Spanish subjects. Still, the flow of weapons tilted the balance further. By the 1820s, Comanche warriors could meet Apache muskets with their own, backed by a lifetime of skill with bow and lance. The effect in battle was devastating. A war party might open a fight with a crashing volley from muskets or captured carbines, then close the distance in a whirlwind of galloping ponies, arrows, and flashing lances. Even when the guns misfired, as they often did in rain or damp, the Comanche bow was a marvel. Short, powerful, and deadly in the hands of a rider who could loose 3 arrows before an enemy had rammed home a second musket ball. Apache leaders were forced into a grim choice. Some, like the Lipan Apache in Texas, sought alliances, even peace, with the Comanche, hoping to survive as partners rather than prey. Others, especially the Mescalero and Chiricahua, hardened their resistance. They tightened their networks with Mexican settlements, traded furs and hides for powder and lead, and trained their young men for the kind of war that could bleed the Comanche without meeting them in full battle. Ambush became the Apache's sharpest weapon. A patrol of Comanche scouts might ride through a narrow pass and find themselves in a storm of gunfire and arrows from the rocks above. Horses went down first, and always the first target, leaving the riders on foot vulnerable, their mobility stolen in an instant. In those moments the fight became one of sheer will, blades and war clubs swinging in the snow or dust, the yells of the wounded mingling with the war cries of the attackers. Yet every Apache victory was answered. The Comanche seemed inexhaustible, their warriors multiplying like the mustangs they bred. For every canyon where they were caught, there was another village burned in retaliation, another herd driven off into the sunrise. By the mid-1830s, the old Spanish frontier was gone, replaced by Mexican rule. But the Comanche-Apache feud remained untouched by the changing flags. In fact, the instability of the Mexican frontier often made things worse. Garrisons were undermanned, patrols infrequent, and the vast spaces between settlements became hunting grounds for mounted raiders. One such raid, remembered bitterly in Apache oral history, came in the autumn of 1837. A Chiricahua band had moved east in search of buffalo. grazing their horses near the headwaters of the Pecos River. The dawn came slow that autumn morning, a pale ribbon of light just beginning to stretch across the Pecos headwaters. In the Chiricahua camp, the fires had burned low. Horses cropped quietly at the frost-tipped grass near the picket line, their breath steaming in the chill. A woman stirred the embers, coaxing a flame for the first pot of coffee. A boy yawned and reached for his bow. There was peace in those moments, the kind that makes warriors drop their guard. Then came the sound. At first it was nothing more than a tremor underfoot, a faint vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Then it grew, a deep rolling thunder, steady and swift. The older warriors knew it instantly. Horses, many horses. The warning shout split the air a heartbeat before the first Comanche riders crested the low ridge to the east. They came like a wave, 100 strong, the sun catching on the polished steel of lance tips and the bright paint of war shields. Their ponies were draped in buffalo hide, manes bound with red-dyed horsehair. War cries rose over the drumming of hooves, high and sharp, the kind of sound that clawed into a man's chest. The first line of riders hit the camp before the Chiricahua could form a defence. Lances drove into the picket line, severing ropes, sending the precious horses screaming into the open with Comanche riders wheeling to catch them. Muskets cracked from the lodges, the acrid stink of powder rolling through the smoke of sudden fires. A Comanche went down, his pony tumbling in a spray of dirt, but another leapt over the fallen pair and plunged into the chaos. Women snatched up children and fled toward the tree line, arrows hissing past them to bite into the ground. A warrior with a musket fired from behind an overturned travois, the shot shattering a Comanche's arm. But the rider kept coming, swinging a rawhide shield to knock the barrel aside and thrusting his lance clean through the man's chest. Horses bolted in every direction, some still dragging picket stakes, others riderless and wild-eyed. Comanche youths darted among them, swinging rawhide lariats, roping mounts even as the fight raged around them. Every animal taken was another victory, another blow that would cripple the Chiricahua through the coming winter. The ground was churned to mud under hooves and boots. Smoke from burning shelters mingled with the metallic tang of blood. A Chiricahua boy, no more than 12, stood frozen in the open, clutching a short bow with no arrow on the string. A Comanche rider swerved toward him, hand raised for a killing blow. But the boy's uncle came out of nowhere, tackling the horse's flank, stabbing upward with a stone knife. The rider toppled, and the pony tore off into the melee, reins trailing in the dirt. It could not last. The Chiricahua were outnumbered and outflanked, the Comanche moving like water around every attempt to stand and fight. In less than an hour, the camp lay in ruins. Those not dead or fled into the timber were stripped of their weapons. The Comanche gathered their spoils, nearly every horse in the camp, and drove them out at a gallop, the herd kicking up a great cloud of dust that hung over the wreckage like a shroud. For the survivors, it was more than a defeat. It was the severing of their mobility, their ability to hunt, to raid, to move with the herds. And for the Comanche, it was the perfect strike. Swift, total, and devastating, the kind of raid that would be spoken of for years around both camps' fires. It was a demonstration that the Comanche could project their power almost anywhere, at will. But power has limits, even on the plains. As the 1840s dawned, a new force began to creep into the southern plains: American expansion. Traders came first, offering rifles far superior to the old Spanish muskets, along with powder that burned cleaner and shot that flew straighter. The Comanche took to these weapons with enthusiasm, integrating them into their already fearsome tactics. The Apache, too, gained access, though often more slowly and in fewer numbers. But where the Comanche favoured the mounted charge, the Apache adapted the rifle to their style of war: long-range ambushes, deliberate, aimed fire from cover, and sudden withdrawal before the enemy could close. A single skilled marksman could drop a horse at 200 yards, breaking the momentum of an entire Comanche charge. Yet neither side ever truly abandoned the old weapons. The bow still had its place, silent, fast, and deadly in the press of close combat. The lance remained the symbol of warrior prowess, a weapon as much about honour as practicality. The war club, the knife, even the humble sling, all had their moment on the southern plains, and all drew blood. By the time Mexico ceded vast swathes of the Southwest to the United States in 1848, the Comanche and Apache feud had already shaped the map. Apache power was fragmented, forced into the mountains and deserts, while the Comanche roamed a domain the size of a European kingdom, a territory the Texans called Comancheria. But if the Apache were diminished, they were not destroyed. And in the new reality of American rule, both peoples faced a common challenge: settlers, soldiers, and surveyors pushing into lands that had belonged to the buffalo and the horse for generations. For a time, the old enemies still found cause to fight each other. A horse raid here, an ambush there, the blood debts never fully paid. But the winds were shifting. The Americans were not Spaniards, nor Mexicans. They came in greater numbers, with heavier weapons, and with an intent to stay. In that changing landscape, the Comanche-Apache War would take on a different shape. The battles would be fewer, but often fiercer, and the decisions made in those years would determine whether these legendary riders of the southern plains could adapt, survive, or vanish into history. The 1850s brought a different kind of danger to the southern plains, one that neither Comanche nor Apache could raid away. The trickle of American settlers became a tide. Wagon ruts carved through prairie grass, soldiers built forts along the rivers, and surveyors began drawing neat lines across maps that had once been nothing but open country. Buffalo herds, the lifeblood of both peoples, were pushed back, slaughtered for hides and sport. For centuries, Comanche and Apache warriors had measured their strength against each other. Now they faced an enemy that came not in small war parties, but in columns of blue-coated infantry, armed with rifled muskets, and backed by the promise of endless reinforcements. The old blood feud did not vanish overnight. In the early years of American rule, Comanche war bands still clashed with Apache scouts over waterholes and grazing land. An Apache hunter might return to find his horse herd gone, driven north by laughing Comanche riders. A Comanche scout might vanish in a canyon ambush, his weapons stripped and his pony led away in triumph. But these were no longer the centerpiece of life. They were embers in a fire now burning on many fronts. Some Apache leaders began to see an opportunity in the changing world. If the Comanche were weakened by fighting the Americans and Texans, perhaps old lands could be reclaimed. Apache scouts sometimes rode alongside US cavalry, guiding them into Comancheria in exchange for food, weapons, or promises of peace. Those promises were rarely kept, but for a brief moment, the enemy of my enemy became an uneasy ally. For the Comanche, such alliances were seen as treachery, another insult to be answered in kind. Raids against Apache camps in the 1850s and 60s were as much about punishing these perceived betrayals as they were about securing resources. Yet even as the war parties rode, their numbers were thinning. Disease, carried on the same trade routes that once brought horses and guns, swept through the lodges. Smallpox, cholera, measles, enemies without faces, striking the young and the old alike. By the late 1860s, the Comanche-Apache conflict was no longer the great shaping force of the southern plains. It was being eclipsed by the relentless expansion of American power. The US Army now fielded mounted units with repeating carbines, weapons that could fire 7 shots before reloading, spitting lead faster than any warrior could loose arrows. Supply trains kept them fed and armed through campaigns that lasted entire seasons. The open prairie, once the Comanche's greatest advantage, began to work against them. There was no hiding from scouts who could follow tracks for days, and no outrunning columns of cavalry that could change mounts at every fort. For the Apache, the mountains still offered refuge, but even there the noose was tightening. Soldiers and scouts learned the passes, cut off the waterholes, and kept up a pressure that ground down even the most elusive bands. One of the last great clashes between Comanche and Apache came in 1872, almost by accident. A small mescalero band, fleeing an American patrol, crossed into territory still patrolled by Comanche raiders. The Comanche saw them not as fellow embattled warriors, but as prey. In the rolling breaks of the Canadian River, the two sides collided. The mescalero, fighting with a mix of captured rifles and old muskets, made a stand among the cottonwoods, their shots echoing across the water. The Comanche came on fast, war cries splitting the air, lances gleaming in the sun. The fight was fierce, but short. The mescalero broke under the charge, scattering into the brush. A handful escaped, the rest lay in the dust or were taken captive. It was a victory of the old kind, swift, brutal, absolute, but it meant little in the greater scheme. The next week, a US cavalry patrol swept through the same country, scattering the Comanche themselves. As the 1870s closed, both peoples were being drawn into reservation life. For the Comanche, the surrender of Quannaparka in 1875 marked the end of the last great free-ranging bands. The Apache would fight on a little longer, especially under leaders like Victorio, Jew, and the famed Geronimo. But the writing was on the wall. Without the buffalo, without free range for their horses, the old ways could not survive. The feud that had once been the heartbeat of the southern plains faded into memory. Children born on the reservations heard the stories of their fathers and grandfathers, of raids under a red sunrise, of war cries across the prairie, of the long rides home with the wind in their faces, but they would never live them. The weapons were still there, polished and kept in trunks, but they were relics now, not tools of survival. And yet, the rivalry left its mark. For over a century, the Comanche and Apache had tested each other, honed each other, and, in a strange way, defined each other. The Comanche learned to respect the Apache's mastery of the rough country. The Apache learned to respect the Comanche's dominance on the open plains. Their conflict shaped alliances with European powers, determined the flow of trade, and even influenced the pace of settlement. In the long view of history, neither side won in the way their ancestors might have dreamed. The land they fought over became part of a nation that belonged to neither. But in the stories passed down, in the pride of descendants who still ride, still hunt, still speak the old words, there remains a victory of a different kind. Endurance. Today, when historians speak of the southern plains, they cannot tell the story without speaking of the Comanche and the Apache. Not as footnotes, but as the central figures of an epic. Two peoples bound together by geography, rivalry, and the hard beauty of a land that demanded everything from those who would claim it. If you stand on a rise in West Texas or eastern New Mexico, when the wind is right and the sky is wide, you might almost hear it. The drumming of hooves, the whistle of arrows, the shouted challenge in two proud tongues, echoes of a time when the prairie was ruled not by maps and deeds, but by those who could ride it best and fight for it longest. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.